In 1942, the Japanese Zero owned the sky over the Pacific, and slower American planes kept falling into the sea. Young pilots climbed into old fighters each morning, and too many of them never came back down alive. The Navy needed a killer, a plane fast enough and strong enough to hunt the Zero and win the war. They already had that plane sitting in a hangar, and they had just stamped it useless and pushed it out the door. The plane was the Vought F-4U Corsair, and by the end of the war, it would carry an 11-to-1 kill record. But first, the men in charge watched it bounce on a carrier deck, and they wrote one cold word beside its name. That word was Unlandable, and it followed the fastest fighter in the Navy like a stain nobody wanted to touch. The story starts 3 years earlier, inside a quiet drawing office at the Vought plant in Stratford, Connecticut. A designer named Rex Beisel bent over a wide table, and he wanted the fastest Navy fighter that anyone had ever built. Beisel had one bold idea in his head, and he said it out loud to the engineers standing around him. "We take the biggest engine in the country," Beisel said, "and we bolt it onto the smallest airframe that can hold it." The engine he wanted was the new Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp, a radial with 18 cylinders and 2,000 horsepower. No fighter in the world carried an engine that big, and the raw power of it made the whole plan possible. To turn that power into speed, the plane needed a propeller far larger than anything a fighter had ever used before. The engineers ran the numbers, and the answer came back huge: a propeller 13 feet and 4 inches across from tip to tip. "A blade that big will chew the runway to pieces," one engineer said, staring at the figure on the page. "It has to spin high off the ground," Beisel answered, "and that means long legs to lift the nose way up." Long legs were the problem, because long legs are thin and weak, and thin, weak legs snap on a hard carrier landing. Beisel walked the office for a long while, and then he came back to the table with a strange new shape. He drew a wing that dropped down where it met the body, then bent back up again out toward the tips. The wing looked like a wide letter W, and men who saw it started calling it the bent wing right away. The strange bend did two clever things at once, and both of them mattered more than they looked on paper. First, the low point of the wing sat close to the ground, so the landing legs could be short, thick, and strong. Second, the wing met the round body at a clean angle, which cut drag and helped the plane slip through the air. "The bend gives us short legs and a fast wing in one move," Beisel told his team with a small smile. The men in the office nodded, because they could see the plane taking shape, ugly and beautiful at the same time. They started calling it the Bent Wing Bird, and the odd nickname stuck to the Corsair for the rest of its life. On paper, it was the fastest fighter in the world, but paper had never once flown a single foot off the ground. On the 29th of May, 1940, a test pilot named Boone Guyton climbed into the first Corsair ever built. The ground crew pulled the chocks away, the huge propeller began to spin, and the whole airframe shook with raw power. Guyton pushed the throttle forward, and the big fighter rolled down the runway with a deep, hard roar that shook the hangars. The Corsair lifted off, tucked up its wheels, and climbed into the sky faster than anything the Navy had ever flown. On the ground, the engineers watched it shrink to a dot, and one of them let out a long, slow breath. "She flies," Guyton said over the radio, "and she wants to go up, not down, the moment you touch the throttle." The plane came home, touched the runway, and rolled to a stop, and the men crowded around it to shake Guyton's hand. The test flights went on for weeks, and the Corsair kept doing things that no other American fighter of that day could do. On the 1st of October, 1940, Guyton took the plane up for a run between two cities in Connecticut. He opened the throttle wide, held the nose level, and let the big Double Wasp pull the fighter faster and faster through the air. When the men checked the numbers, they could hardly believe them, because the Corsair had passed 400 miles an hour in level flight. No American single-engine fighter had ever crossed that line, and the men at Vought knew they had built something truly new. 400 miles an hour, an engineer said, holding the paper up, and she has more speed left in her than that. Plane that would one day be called useless had just set a record that shook whole American aircraft world. The road to that record was not smooth, and one flight nearly ended the whole program before the war even started for America. Guyton took the prototype up one day, and thick fog rolled in and swallowed the ground while he was still in the air. He could not see the runway, he could not see the trees, and he could not find a safe place to come down. Low on fuel and out of choices, Guyton picked a flat gray patch below him and brought the Corsair down onto it. The flat patch was a golf course, wet and soft, and the big fighter slammed into it and tore across the grass. Metal ripped away, the plane spun and skidded, and it finally stopped as a broken heap far from the runway. Guyton climbed out of the wreck alive, shaken but whole, and he walked across the golf course on his own 2 legs. The crash could have killed the whole program, right? But the men at Vought refused to give the fast fighter up. They hauled the broken Corsair back to to the plant on a truck, laid the pieces out, and studied every bent part. She saved his life in that crash, one mechanic said, running his hand along a torn panel, so she is worth rebuilding. They rebuilt the plane by hand. They fixed what the fog had broken, and they learned from every crack they found in the metal. The program went forward. The Navy stayed interested, and the Corsair kept flying test after test through the last months of peace. Then came December of 1941. Pearl Harbor burned, and suddenly the Navy needed every fast fighter it could possibly get. The question now was simple and hard: whether this record-setting speed machine could actually land on the deck of a ship at sea. In 1942, the Navy took the Corsair out to a carrier for landing trials, and the trials went wrong at once. The nose of the Corsair was long, because the long nose held the huge engine and the big tank of fuel behind it. When a pilot slowed the plane down to land, the nose rose up high, and it blocked his view of everything ahead. A pilot could see the sky, he could see the sides, but he could not see the deck he was trying to hit. "I have lost the ship," one pilot called on the radio during his approach. "The nose is covering the whole landing area." He had to guess where the deck was, and guessing where a carrier deck is at landing speed is a fast way to die. The Navy watched pass after pass, and the blind nose alone was enough to make every carrier captain nervous about the plane. The blind nose was only the start, because the landing legs that Beisel had made short and strong had a hidden fault. The legs were stiff, and when the wheels hit the deck hard, the stiff legs pushed straight back and threw the plane up. The Corsair would touch down, then leap high into the air, sail right over the arresting wires, and come down again. A bounce like that could send the plane into the ships parked forward, or over the side, or straight into the sea. "She hit and jumped like a rock skipping on water," one pilot said after his trial, climbing down from the high cockpit. The deck crews watched the fighter bounce again and again, and every bounce was a chance for a young pilot to be killed. The plane that flew so cleanly in the air turned into a wild, jumping thing the moment its wheels touched the steel. There was one more fault, and it was the most dangerous of all, hidden in the way the wing lost its lift. When the Corsair slowed down for landing, the left wing quit flying just before the right wing did, with no warning at all. The plane would suddenly drop its left side and roll hard, low and slow, right over the deck where there was no room. A roll like that near the water gives a pilot almost no time to save himself before the plane hits and breaks apart. On top of all that, hot oil sprayed back from the engine flaps and smeared across the glass in front of the pilot. He could barely see through the oil, the nose blocked the deck, and the wing could drop him without any warning. The Navy men added it all up: the blind nose, the high bounce, the sudden roll, and they made their choice about the plane. They wrote in their report that the Corsair was not fit to land on an aircraft carrier, and they pulled it off the ships. The fastest fighter the Navy owned, the plane that had smashed the 400-mile-an-hour record, was pushed aside. Pilots gave it cruel names to match the way it killed, and one of those names cut the deepest of all. They called it the Ensign Eliminator, because it kept killing young ensigns who were still learning how to fly it. They called it the Bent Wing Widowmaker, and mothers of new pilots would have shaken to hear either name spoken aloud. The Navy had a fighter that could beat the Zero, and it had locked that fighter away over a landing it could not master. So the fastest fighter in the fleet got handed down to the Marines to fly from rough strips on faraway islands. That should have been the quiet end of a proud machine, tossed aside before it ever fired a shot at a real enemy. But the Marines did not fly from carriers, so they did not care one bit about a smooth landing on a steel deck. They flew from dirt, from coral, and from mud strips scraped out of the jungle on islands close to the fighting. The Marines cared about one thing only: whether this loud, strange fighter could climb up fast and kill the Zero in the air. "Let the Navy keep their carriers," a Marine officer said. "We will take that engine and use it to hunt planes." So the Corsair went south, into the war, to a hot green island where the fighting had already ground men down for months. The island was Guadalcanal, and the pilots there had watched too many friends fall burning into the water around it. In February of 1943, the 1st Corsair Squadron, the Marines of Fighting 124, flew into Guadalcanal at last. Their planes were fresh from the factory, the paint still bright, and most of the pilots had never fought a real battle before. The ground crews already on the island walked around the strange bent wings, tapping the metal and staring up at the giant propeller. "So this is the plane the Navy could not land," a young mechanic said, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "Then the Navy is blind," an older sergeant answered, "because I have never heard an engine sound as strong as that one." The men fueled the Corsairs, loaded the guns, and got the rejected fighter ready to fly into its very first real fight. Above them, the sky belonged to the enemy, and the wrecks of old ships still lay in the water as a hard warning. Each Corsair carried 6 machine guns, 3 buried in each wing, and every one of them was the heavy 50 caliber Browning. 650s, the armorer told the new pilots, 12.7mm each, and enough rounds to cut a bomber clean in half. The wings folded straight up on a hinge, so the planes could pack tight along the narrow strip without wasting space. Even folded, the Corsair stood tall on its short, strong legs, its huge propeller hanging over the men like a dark wheel. The pilots climbed up the high sides of the fighters, dropped down into the cockpits, and strapped themselves in for the first time. The big radial engines coughed, caught, and roared, and blue smoke drifted back over the strip in the hot morning air. One by one, the Corsairs rolled through the mud, lifted their long noses, and clawed up into the bright tropical sky. The first missions sent the Corsairs up the long chain of islands, guarding slow bombers on their way to the enemy bases. The bombers flew toward places like Bougainville, where the Japanese kept crowded airfields full of Zeros and fast bombers of their own. The Corsair pilots learned fast that this new plane did not fight the way the small, old Wildcats they knew had fought. "Do not turn with a Zero," the flight leaders warned again and again. "He will turn inside you and get on your tail." The Zero was light and quick, and it could twist through tight circles that no heavy Corsair could ever hope to follow. A Corsair pilot who tried to turn with a Zero would lose the fight, and losing that fight almost always meant dying. But the Corsair held 2 great gifts the Zero did not: real speed in a dive and thick armor around the pilot. "You come down on him from above," a flight leader said, scratching a diagram into the dirt with a broken stick. "You fire in one fast pass, then you keep diving, and you never, ever slow down to fight him turn for turn." He drew the line of the dive, then a sharp line back up, and he tapped the second line hard with the stick. "You climb away, you get your height back, and you come down on the next one the very same way," he said. The pilots practiced the trick over dry ground, a hard slash from high up, and then a fast climb back to safety. They named it Boom and Zoom, and it turned the Corsair's great weight and power from a weakness into a killing tool. When the real fights came, the plan held, and Corsairs began to knock Zeros out of the sky one after another. The enemy pilots learned to fear the sound of the plane before they ever saw it come down out of the sun. The Corsair made a strange, high whistle in the air, a scream of wind rushing through the cooling vents in its wings. A Japanese pilot would hear that whistle rising behind him, and by the time he turned his head, the guns were already firing. The captured papers said the Japanese had a name for the plane, and the name told you exactly what they thought of it. "They call it Whistling Death," an officer read aloud from a translated document, and the men on the strip laughed out loud. The plane the Navy had thrown away now had the enemy naming it after the very sound it made while it killed them. From reject to Whistling Death in a matter of weeks, and the fighter had not even reached its full strength yet. Still, the Corsair kept biting its own pilots too, because the old landing troubles followed the fighter down onto solid ground. The strip at Guadalcanal was short and rough, and the plane that bounced on carrier decks bounced on hard dirt as well. Young pilots came in too fast, felt the left wing drop, and cartwheeled off the end of the runway into the trees. The mechanics would run out to the wreck, pull the shaken pilot free, and drag the broken metal off to the side. "She is the best plane I ever flew and the scariest one too," one young pilot said. Still white after a bad landing, the men lined up the next flight for the next mission, and they learned to respect the plane on the ground as much as in the air. Every takeoff was a promise of a fight, and every landing was a small fight all its own against the bent wingbird. One pilot rose above the crashes and the fear, a Marine named Ken Walsh, who flew the Corsair like it was part of his own body. Walsh had been an aircraft mechanic before he ever became a pilot, so he understood the Corsair's engine down to the smallest bolt. He knew what the plane could take and what it could give, and he trusted it in places where other men held back. "Treat her right and she gives you everything she has," Walsh told the new pilots waiting by the strip. "Push her the wrong way and she throws you straight at the ground," he went on, "so learn her before you fight in her." Walsh climbed high on every mission, kept his speed up, and dove on the enemy out of the sun where they could not see him. Zero after zero fell under his 650s, and the number of his kills climbed higher week after week over the islands. Soon Ken Walsh became the first man ever to make ace flying the Corsair. 5 enemy planes shot down in air combat. 5 turned into 10, and 10 kept climbing. And the mechanic's son proved that the rejected fighter could make the finest of aces. On the 15th of August, 1943, Walsh met a swarm of enemy planes and waded straight into the middle of them. He shot down several that day, then turned for home with his fighter shot full of holes and his engine barely running. He nursed the wounded Corsair back over the water, put it down, and walked away to fly again the very next week. The plane took the hits, kept flying, and brought him home, and no Light Zero could have done the same for its pilot. Walsh looked at the bullet holes in his wings and knew the armor and the strong airframe had just saved his life. 2 weeks later, on the 30th of August, Ken Walsh flew straight into the hardest fight of his entire life over the water. He was escorting bombers toward the enemy base at Kahili when his engine began to fail and he fell behind the group. His Corsair could not keep up, but Walsh refused to turn back, and he pushed the sick plane on toward the target alone. When he reached the enemy, dozens of Japanese fighters swarmed the American formation, and Walsh threw himself into the middle of the swarm. He shot down 4 enemy planes in that single wild fight, guns hammering, while their fire tore his own fighter apart around him. His engine finally died, his controls went soft, and Walsh rode the crippled Corsair down toward the sea with almost nothing working. He crash-landed hard on the water, climbed out into a rubber raft, and was picked up alive to fight another day. For that fight and the ones before it, the Navy later gave Ken Walsh the Medal of Honor, the highest award his country had. The plane they had called Unlandable had carried a mechanic's son through a battle that should have killed him 10 times over. Word of it spread fast through the Pacific, and other pilots stopped seeing the Corsair as a curse and started seeing it as a shield. Men who once feared the ensign eliminator now fought hard to get a seat in the loud bent-wing bird. The fighter was winning battles, making aces, and earning medals, all from rough island strips far from any carrier deck. Yet one hard fact still hung over the whole story, and it was the same fact that had started all the trouble. As long as the Corsair could not land on a carrier, the war at sea still belonged to older, slower planes. The Navy's carriers were the real spear of the Pacific War, and those carriers still flew fighters that could not match the Corsair. Every mission from a carrier deck sent slower planes into the enemy guns, when a better fighter sat winning battles on land. The Corsair was king over the islands, but the ocean itself belonged to ships, and ships needed planes that could come home to them. Somewhere the plane had to change, or the men who flew it had to find a brand new way to bring it down. Down at the strips, the ground crews saw the same landing failures every single day, and they knew the plane deserved better. "The engine is perfect and the guns are perfect," a crew chief said, running his hand along the leading edge of a wing. "So the only real problem is the landing," he went on. "And a landing is a thing that smart men can fix." He did not know it yet, but the cure for the deadly dropped wing would be a strip of metal small enough to hold in one hand. That fix was still weeks away, hidden in the future, and the fighting over the islands would not wait for anyone to catch up. Because to break the enemy's grip on the whole region, the Americans had to smash the strongest Japanese base in the South Pacific. That base was Rabaul on the island of New Britain, and it was ringed with airfields, packed with planes and thick with guns. The Japanese had made Rabaul into a fortress, and any plane that flew over it had to pass through a wall of fire. To choke Rabaul, the Corsairs had to escort the bombers into that wall again and again, and take the losses that came with it. Into that grinder flew a new squadron, and a leader whose name would ring across the whole Pacific War for the rest of time. The squadron was fighting 214, and the men in it proudly called themselves the Black Sheep, spare pilots and cast-offs thrown together. Their leader was a hard, blunt Marine named Gregory Boyington, and the men called him Pappy because he was older than the rest of them. Boyington had already fought the Japanese before this war, flying in China with the famous American volunteer group known as the Flying Tigers. He knew the enemy planes, he knew their tricks, and he knew exactly how to kill them from long, hard experience over China. "I have shot these people down before," Boyington told his young pilots, "and this Corsair beats anything I ever flew over there." He led the Black Sheep straight at Rabaul, and he flew the Corsair the way Beisel had built it to be flown, fast and mean. He climbed above the enemy, dove through their formations, and pulled up and away before their slower fighters could ever get a shot at him. Boyington's kills piled up fast over Rabaul, and soon his score stood among the very highest in the whole Marine Corps. His men followed his lead into every fight, and the Black Sheep tore through the Rabaul defenders like a storm through dry grass. The Corsair gave them the speed to choose their fights, and the armor to live through the fights they could not avoid. Time after time, the bent-wing fighters flew home full of holes. Engines still running, pilots still alive inside the torn metal. A Zero could never take that kind of punishment, and a Zero could never save its pilot the way the Corsair saved its own. The plane, once cursed as an eliminator of green ensigns, was now a maker of aces, turning out one famous flyer after another, and at the front of them all flew Pappy Boyington, chasing the enemy over their own fortress, driving his score higher with every mission he led. On the 3rd of January, 1944, Pappy Boyington led a large sweep of Corsairs over Rabaul, hunting enemy planes in the air. He climbed high above the base with the sun behind him, and he watched the Japanese fighters rise to meet his flight. Boyington rolled over and dove into the middle of them, guns hammering, and another enemy plane fell burning toward the sea below. He shot down more that morning, pushing his score higher, but the Japanese fighters kept coming and swarmed his flight from every side. His wingman stayed close for a while, then lost him in the swirling mass of planes. Turning and diving through the smoke, "I have lost Pappy," the wingman called over the radio. Searching the sky, I cannot see his plane down there at all. Boyington's Corsair had taken hits, caught fire, and dropped away toward the water while the fight roared on high above him. Boyington rode the burning fighter down and hit the water hard, but he climbed out of the sinking plane and stayed alive. He floated in the open sea for hours, watching for rescue, until a Japanese submarine surfaced nearby and pulled him from the waves. They took him prisoner, and he spent the last 20 months of the war, locked inside a Japanese prison camp far from home. His own men believed he was dead, and the whole country mourned a hero. But Pappy Boyington was alive and would come home. For his long record over Rabaul in China, the country gave Boyington the Medal of Honor while he still sat behind the wire. The black sheep flew on without him, and the loud bent wing fighters kept tearing the enemy out of the sky over Rabaul. His capture did not slow the plane at all, because by now, the Corsair had many killers flying it, not just one. One of those killers was a young Marine named Robert Hansen, who flew with a squadron called Fighting 215 over Rabaul. His friends called him Butcher Bob because when he found the enemy in the air, he took them apart without any mercy. Hansen did not fear the close fight the way most Corsair pilots did, and he pressed in until he could not miss. He drove his fighter right up behind an enemy plane, opened fire from close range, and watched it break apart in the air. Then he rolled onto the next one and did the same thing again, moving through a formation like a wolf through sheep. "Get in close and you cannot miss," Hansen told the other pilots. "So close you can see the rivets on his wing." He flew the Corsair hard and low and fast, and his score climbed, at a speed that shocked even the men in his own squadron. Over about 17 days of fighting above Rabaul, Robert Hansen shot down 25 enemy planes, one of the fastest streaks of the whole war. He downed several in a single mission more than once, throwing himself at the enemy formations while other pilots held back and covered him. The Corsair gave him the speed to catch anything, and the guns to end each fight in one hard, short pass. On the 3rd of February, 1944, Hansen flew low to strafe a Japanese lighthouse position near the coast of New Ireland. Ground fire reached up and caught his fighter, and the plane went into the water before he could ever climb back to safety. He died one day before his 24th birthday, and the country later gave Robert Hansen the Medal of Honor for his short, fierce war. The plane the Navy had thrown away had now carried 3 Medal of Honor pilots, Walsh and Boyington and Hansen, over the same islands. All through late 1943 and early 1944, the Corsairs ground the enemy air force down over the fortress of Rabaul. Every mission north meant escorting bombers into a wall of guns, or sweeping the sky to draw the Japanese fighters up to fight. The Corsairs met them again and again, and each fight left more enemy planes in the water and fewer defending the base. The Japanese poured in new pilots and new planes to hold Rabaul, and the Corsairs shot those down too, week after week. Slowly, the enemy air force over Rabaul bled to death, losing planes faster than the factories back in Japan could ever replace them. "They keep sending them up," one pilot said after a mission, "and we keep sending them down into the sea for good." The bent wing fighters were not just winning single fights now. They were killing an entire enemy air force, one plane at a time. By late February of 1944, the sky over Rabaul had gone quiet, because the enemy had almost no planes left to send up. The Japanese finally pulled their surviving aircraft back out of Rabaul, giving up the air over their own great fortress in the south. The base still had its guns and its men, but without planes. It could no longer strike out at the American forces closing in around it. So the Americans simply flew past it, cut it off, and left the strong fortress to sit useless while the war moved on toward Japan. The Corsair had helped break one of the strongest enemy bases in the whole Pacific, not with bombs alone, but by clearing its sky. The plane, once judged unfit to even land, had helped win one of the longest air campaigns of the entire war. And it had done all of it from mud and coral strips, still barred from the carrier decks where the Navy's real power waited. While the Marines fought from the land, one Navy squadron kept trying to prove the Corsair belonged on a carrier after all. That squadron was Fighting 17, the Jolly Rogers, and they flew. The bent wing bird under a black flag with a white skull. Their leader was a stubborn, sharp pilot named Tom Blackburn, and he refused to accept the old report that called his plane unlandable. That report was written about an old plane and scared men. Blackburn told his pilots, and we are neither of those things. He drilled his men on carrier landings until they could bring the heavy fighter down onto a deck, as well as anyone in the Navy. They qualified aboard the carrier Bunker Hill, catching the wires again, and again proving the Corsair could come home to a moving ship at sea. Blackburn had shown the Navy exactly what his squadron could do, and for a moment it looked like the Corsair would join the fleet at last. But the Navy still worried about spare parts and supply, and they feared mixing a brand new fighter into their carrier supply lines mid-war. So the Navy pulled Fighting 17 off the carrier and sent the Jolly Rogers to fight from a land strip at New Georgia instead. Blackburn was angry, but his men flew anyway, guarding the landings on Bougainville and escorting the bombers deep into the fire over Rabaul. They proved every bit as deadly from the dirt as they would have been from a deck, and their kill count climbed fast. One pilot in the squadron rose above all the rest, a quiet young flyer named Ira Kepford, who shot planes down with cold, steady skill. Kepford dove hard, aimed well, and pressed each fight until the enemy was falling, and soon he became the top Navy ace flying the Corsair. The Navy had sent its best Corsair squadron to the land, and from the land it made the finest Corsair ace the Navy would ever have. One fight showed exactly what kind of pilot Ira Kepford was, and exactly what the Corsair could do down low in the right hands. On a mission over the water, a fast Japanese fighter latched onto Kepford's tail and chased him down until both planes skimmed just above the waves. The enemy pilot stayed on him and kept firing, and Kepford could not shake the plane, no matter how hard he twisted and turned. Kepford used the one thing the Corsair had that the light enemy fighter did not: raw engine power close to the surface of the sea. He forced a hard, flat turn right at the edge of a stall, so low that his wingtip almost cut into the water. The enemy pilot tried to follow that turn, ran out of room and speed at once, and flew straight into the sea below. Kepford rolled level and roared away untouched, and by the time his squadron rotated home, 16 enemy planes had fallen to his guns. The Corsair was making aces on every front now, but the hard fact that had started the whole story still had not gone away. As long as the plane could not land safely on a carrier, the Navy's greatest weapon still flew slower, older fighters into the enemy guns. The Corsair ruled the islands, but the ocean itself belonged to ships, and ships needed planes that could take off and come home to a deck. So while the pilots fought over Rabaul, other men fought a quieter war back home, a war against the plane's own deadly landing faults. Engineers at the plant and at the Navy test fields took the Corsair apart, flew it over and over, and studied every failure it showed them. They already knew the three problems by heart: the blind nose, the high bounce, and the sudden roll that killed young pilots near the deck. One by one, they went after those three problems, and one by one, they found fixes so simple that the old fears began to look foolish. The worst of the three was the sudden roll, and the engineers finally traced it back to the exact way the wing lost its lift. As the Corsair slowed to land, the air broke away from the left wing just a little sooner than it broke away from the right. That tiny difference made the left wing quit flying first, and the plane would drop that side and roll hard, low over the deck. To fix it, the engineers needed to make both wings quit flying at the very same moment, so the plane would settle straight instead of rolling. They found the answer in a strip of metal so small that a man could hide it in the palm of one hand. 6 inches of metal, a test engineer said, holding the little strip up in the light, and it saves lives on every single landing. They bolted the small strip onto the leading edge of the right wing, out past the guns, and sent the fighter up to try it. The little strip broke the airflow over the right wing just enough to match the left, so now both wings gave up their lift together. When the Corsair slowed to land, it no longer dropped a wing and rolled. It simply settled straight ahead and stayed under control. A pilot could bring the plane right down to the edge of a stall and trust it not to throw him at the ground. The fix cost almost nothing, it weighed almost nothing, and it should have been found 2 full years before the Navy ever wrote that report. But the men who tested the plane back then had not looked for a small fix. They had simply judged the plane and thrown it away. Now a strip of scrap metal had beaten the fault that killed young ensigns, and it had done it without changing the engine or the guns. The deadly roll was dead, and the engineers turned to the second problem, the long nose that hid the deck from the pilot's eyes. The blind nose came from the plane's whole design, because the long nose held the huge engine and the big fuel tank behind it. When the pilot slowed the Corsair to land, the nose rose up high, and it covered the deck the pilot was trying to reach. The engineers could not shorten the nose without ruining the plane, so instead they lifted the man higher to look out over it. They raised the pilot's seat and moved the whole cockpit up and back, giving the flyer a clear line of sight over the long nose. On the new model, the F4U-1A, the pilot sat higher, and he could finally see enough of the deck to judge his landing. Then the engineers went after the canopy itself, which had thick metal bars across it that blocked the pilot's view to the sides and back. They cut away the heavy frame and fitted a clean, clear bubble of glass, so the pilot could see out in almost every direction at once. The oil made the view even worse, because hot oil sprayed back from the engine flaps and smeared across the glass in front of the pilot. On the approach, when a pilot needed to see the most, the front of his canopy was often streaked and blurred with dark engine oil. The engineers found the leak, sealed off the top engine flaps that threw the oil, and kept the windscreen clean for the landing. Now the pilot sat high, looked out through clear glass, and saw the deck in front of him all the way down to the wires. The blind nose that had made men guess where the carrier was, and often guess wrong, no longer hid the deck at the worst moment. 2 of the 3 deadly faults were beaten now, the roll and the blindness, and only the high bounce still stood in the plane's way. The engineers turned to the landing legs, the same short, strong legs that Beisel had built to survive a hard carrier landing in the first place. The legs were strong, but they were also stiff, and a stiff leg does not soak up a hard landing. It pushes back against it. When the wheels hit the deck fast, the stiff legs shoved the whole plane straight back up into the air like a spring. The Corsair would touch, leap high, sail over the arresting wires, and come down again, and any of those bounces could kill a man. The engineers opened up the landing legs and changed the way the oil moved inside them, softening the hard push that threw the plane up. Now when the wheels hit the deck, the legs squeezed down and held, soaking up the shock instead of flinging the fighter back into the sky. The high bounce faded away, and the Corsair began to stay down where it landed, right where the pilot put it on the deck. With that, all 3 deadly faults were beaten: the roll, the blindness, and the bounce, each one killed by a small and simple fix. None of the fixes was flashy, and none of them made the plane faster or gave it a single extra gun or bomb. Together, though, the small changes turned a rejected fighter into a plane that a pilot could trust to bring him home to a moving deck. "We did not build a new plane," a crew chief said, walking around the raised cockpit and the clean new canopy in the shop. "We just stopped fighting the plane we already had," he went on, "and let it do the thing it was always able to do." The Corsair had been a great fighter from the very first flight, and now it was finally a great carrier fighter as well. The engineers kept improving it too, and new models rolled off the lines with better wings, stronger racks, and mounts for bombs and rockets. The plane that started as a pure plane killer was quietly growing into something far larger, a fighter that could do almost any job the Navy asked. New Corsairs came with harder points under the wings, so the ground crews could hang bombs and rockets and fuel tanks beneath the strong bent wings. The wings still folded up for tight parking, the 650 caliber guns still filled the sky with fire, and now the plane could carry a heavy load too. Every new model kept the great engine and the great speed, and added the small fixes that made the plane safe near a deck. The Corsair was becoming the fighter the Navy had needed all along, and it had been sitting in front of them the entire time. Yet even with every fix in place, the Navy still moved slowly, still cautious about the plane it had judged and rejected 2 years before. The men in charge wanted proof, real proof, that a Corsair could fly from a carrier in war and come home safe day after day. And that proof, strangely, would not come first from the American Navy at all, but from allies fighting a very different war across the ocean. Because far across the world, the British had already taken the Corsair to sea, and they had already solved the landing on their own decks. While the American Navy tested and doubted, British pilots were flying the bent-wing fighter-off carriers in the cold gray waters of the North. They had found a different way to bring the plane down, a way the American report had never even thought to try. The fix was not a piece of metal at all. It was a change in how a man flew the plane on his way to the deck. That change would answer the last doubt the American Navy still held, and it would come from pilots who refused to fly straight at a ship. The plane the Navy called Unlandable was about to land on carriers again and again, first under a British flag, then under its own. And once it did, the whole war at sea would tilt, because the fleet was about to face the most frightening enemy of the entire Pacific War. Across the ocean, the British Royal Navy had taken the Corsair for its own carriers, receiving the fighters from America under the Lend-Lease program. British pilots climbed into the bent wingbird and quickly hit the very same problems. The American Navy had hit the blind nose and the hard bounce, but the British carriers were smaller than the American ones, and the Corsair's long wings were almost too wide to fit below the deck. When a British Corsair folded its wings, the tips rose up and nearly scraped the roof of the low hangar deck below. So the British simply cut the plane down to fit, slicing about 8 inches off the tip of each wing with a saw. The clipped wings let the Corsair fold down and ride the elevators cleanly into the hangars below the deck of a British carrier. The change cost a little speed and a little climb, but it let the plane go to sea on ships the Americans thought too small. The British had already reshaped the plane to fit their war, and now they set out to reshape the way their pilots flew at home. The instructors watched their men try to land straight at the deck, and they watched the long nose hide the ship every single time. So they told their pilots to stop flying straight in and to come around the deck in a long, curving turn instead. "Do not come in straight," one instructor told his pilots. "Swing around in a curve and keep your eyes on the deck the whole way down." The pilot flew a wide arc toward the back of the ship, looking out past the side of that long nose the entire time. From the side of the curve, he could see the deck clearly, the wires, the deck crew, and the exact spot where he needed to land. Only at the very last second did he roll his wings level, straighten out, and drop the plane onto the deck to catch a wire. That one change in flying beat the last great fault, and British Corsairs began landing on carriers well before any American Corsair did. The Fleet Air Arm took the bent-wing fighter to sea across the world, flying it from cold decks in seas the plane had never seen. In April of 1944, the British sent Corsairs far north to help attack the huge German battleship Tirpitz, hidden in a Norway fjord. The raid was called Operation Tungsten, and the plan sent dive bombers through the mountains to strike the great ship where she lay at anchor. The Corsairs flew high cover over the bombers, guarding them through the peaks, and holding off any German fighters that tried to rise and fight. The bombers hit the Tirpitz hard, the Corsairs shepherded them home, and the bent-wing fighters landed back on their decks in the freezing air. A plane the American Navy had called Unlandable was now flying combat from carriers in the roughest, coldest waters of the entire war. Later in the war, the British sent their Corsairs east as well, joining the British Pacific Fleet to fight beside the Americans against Japan. British Corsairs flew from carriers with strong steel decks, decks built thicker and harder than the wooden decks the American carriers used. When a kamikaze hit an American carrier, it often smashed deep into the wooden deck and started terrible fires that killed many men. When a kamikaze hit a British carrier, the plane often broke apart against the steel deck, and the crew swept the wreck over the side. "Clear the deck and get us flying again," a British officer ordered after one hit, and the Corsairs were back in the air within the hour. The bent-wing fighters flew from those tough decks near Okinawa, guarding the fleet and striking targets on the Japanese home islands themselves. The plane rejected by one navy had become a front-line carrier fighter for two great navies at once, on opposite sides of the world. The lesson traveled back across the ocean to the Americans. Along with every fix, the engineers had already bolted onto the plane. Now the American Navy held all of it at once. The 6-inch strip, the raised seat, the clear canopy, the softer legs, and the curving approach. Every single reason the Navy had once used to reject the Corsair had been answered, one, by clever men on 2 continents. So the Navy took a fresh look at the fixed Corsair in the spring of 1944. And this time, the trials went the other way. Navy pilots flew the curving approach the British had taught, brought the fixed fighters down onto the deck, and caught the wires clean, pass after pass. The plane no longer rolled. The pilots could see the deck, and the fighter stayed down where it landed instead of bouncing into the sky. In April of 1944, the Navy at last cleared the Corsair to fly and fight from its aircraft carriers, welcoming it home at last. There was one more job the Corsair had already quietly learned, a job that happened only in the dark, long before the carrier clearance came. The Navy had taken a few Corsairs and fitted a small radar unit inside a pod on the right wing, out past the guns. They cut one gun to make room for the gear and turned the fighter into a hunter that could find the enemy at night. These were the F-4U-2 night fighters, and their pilots learned to chase enemy planes through the black sky by watching a small glowing screen. A night fighter pilot would read the radar, creep up behind an unseen enemy in the dark, and open fire from close range without warning. The bent wingbird could now kill by day from the islands, by day from the carriers, and by night with radar in the dark. The plane the Navy had thrown away for a landing was proving useful in more ways than its own makers had ever dreamed. The carrier clearance could not have come at a better time, because a new and terrible threat was rising in the last year of the Pacific War. As the American forces pushed closer to Japan, the enemy began sending pilots to crash their own planes straight into the American ships. They called these attacks kamikaze, and each one was a bomb with a living pilot inside, aimed at the heart of a carrier. A kamikaze did not drop its bomb and fly away. It dove all the way down and rode the plane into the deck itself. To stop them, the fleet needed the fastest fighters it could get, planes that could climb high, dive hard, and destroy the attacker in the air. The old, slower fighters could not always reach a diving kamikaze in time, and every miss meant fire and death on a crowded deck below. The fleet needed the Corsair now more than ever before, and at last the Corsair was ready to answer the call from a carrier deck. Marine Corsair squadrons went aboard the big fleet carriers, flying from the same steel decks that had been closed to their plane for 2 long years. In late December of 1944, the squadrons Fighting 124 and Fighting 213 went aboard the carrier Essex to defend the fleet. They were the first Marine Corsair squadrons ever to fly from an American fleet carrier, sent aboard to help hold off the growing kamikaze raids. The bent wing fighters that had lived on mud and coral for 2 years now folded their wings on a rolling steel deck at sea. When the raids came, the Corsairs were already climbing to meet them, 6 heavy guns loaded and the big engines howling at full power. A kamikaze would dive out of the clouds toward a carrier, and a Corsair would roll in behind it and open fire from close range. The 50 caliber rounds tore the attacker apart in the air, and the burning wreck fell into the sea far short of the ships. Over the island of Okinawa in 1945, the enemy sent wave after wave of suicide planes at the fleet, day after day after day. The fighting off Okinawa became the hardest air defense of the entire Second World War, a storm of attackers falling on the ships around the island. The Japanese called their biggest attacks the floating chrysanthemum raids, and each one sent hundreds of planes at the fleet at the very same time. Day after day, the raids came in over the weeks, and day after day, the Corsairs climbed up to meet them in the sky. To hold the line, the Navy flew a wall of fighters over the fleet at all hours, a shield the men called the Big Blue Blanket. The plan kept Corsairs and other fighters in the air over the ships around the clock, so an attacker always met guns before it reached a deck. The Corsairs patrolled high above the fleet, dove on the kamikazes as they came, and knocked them down before they could reach the carriers. One Marine Corsair squadron at Okinawa earned a fearsome name for the way it cut down the enemy planes over the fleet. They were Fighting 323, and the men called themselves the Death Rattlers, and they became the top-scoring Marine Corsair squadron of the entire war. On some days, the raids were so heavy that the squadron shot down a stunning number of enemy planes in one single wild afternoon. On one day in April, the Death Rattlers threw their fighters at a huge raid and shot down almost a full squadron of enemy planes at once. Over their whole tour, the squadron destroyed more than 100 enemy planes, and it lost very few of its own pilots in return. The The Corsair gave them the speed to catch every attacker, and the guns to end each fight in one short, hard pass. The plane, once cursed as a killer of ensigns, was now the top kamikaze killer over the deadliest waters of the whole war. Sometimes the fighting grew so wild that a pilot ran out of bullets and still would not let an enemy plane through to the fleet. In May of 1945, a Marine pilot named Robert Klingman chased a high-flying Japanese plane far up into the thin, cold air. He climbed after it above 38,000 feet, so high that his guns froze solid and would not fire a single round at the enemy. Klingman did not turn back, and instead he flew his Corsair right up behind the enemy plane and used his spinning propeller as a saw. He chopped into the enemy's tail with his propeller, backed off, and chopped again, cutting the plane apart piece by piece in the sky. The enemy plane lost its tail and fell away, and Klingman flew his damaged Corsair all the way home and landed it safely on the deck. He had shot down a plane with no bullets at all, using only the propeller, and the Navy gave him a medal for the strange, brave kill. The Corsair pilots flew until their guns ran dry, then landed on the deck, rearmed as fast as the crews could work, and climbed right back up. They came down with empty ammunition boxes and barrels too hot to touch, and the deck crews turned them around and sent them up again. "Get me loaded and get me back in the air," one pilot shouted over the engine. "There are more of them coming in behind that last group." The bent-wing fighters climbed and fought and climbed again, holding a wall of guns between the enemy and the ships full of sleeping sailors below. The Corsair had traveled the whole long road now, from reject to shield, from the ensign eliminator to the plane that saved thousands of lives at sea. The men who once feared it as a killer of ensigns now owed it their lives, and they trusted it over the water above all else. The report that had called it unlandable looked more foolish with every kamikaze that fell burning into the sea, short of the crowded decks. The Corsair did far more than guard the fleet, because by now the fighter had learned yet another job on top of killing planes in the air. Ground crews hung bombs and rockets under the strong wings, and the fighter became a heavy hammer against targets on the land and the sea. The plane carried rows of 5-inch rockets under each wing, and it dove on the enemy to fire them straight and true into the target. It dropped bombs on airfields, gun pits, and supply dumps, then climbed back up and fought any enemy plane that dared to rise against it. On the islands, the Marines used the Corsair to help their own men on the ground, flying low right in front of the troops. A pilot would dive on an enemy strongpoint, drop his bomb or fire his rockets, and clear the path for the men crawling forward below him. The Marines came to love the plane over their heads, because the bent wingbird could hit a target close to friendly troops without hitting the troops. One famous man showed that the Corsair could carry a load far heavier than anyone at the factory had ever planned to hang on the plane. That man was Charles Lindbergh, the most famous flyer in America, working in the Pacific as a civilian advisor to the fighter squadrons in the field. Even though he was a civilian, Lindbergh flew combat missions with the pilots, and he taught them things the printed manuals had never covered. He showed them how to lean their engines and stretch their fuel far past what anyone had believed the plane could do on one tank. "Set your engine like this," Lindbergh told them, "and you will fly hundreds of miles farther on the very same tank of gas." Longer range meant the Corsairs could reach targets the enemy believed were far too distant to ever be struck from the American bases. Lindbergh's simple lessons turned the Corsair into a fighter that could hit the enemy where the enemy felt safe, deep behind his own lines. Then Lindbergh proved the plane could haul a huge weight of bombs, loading a Corsair far past the numbers printed in the official manual. He hung one large 2,000-pound bomb under the belly and a 1,000-pound bomb under each wing, and he flew the loaded plane. That was about 4,000 pounds of bombs on a single fighter, far more weight than even the plane's own designers had thought it could carry. The Corsair lifted the heavy load, flew to the target, dropped the bombs, and came home, and the pilots watched with their mouths hanging open. The fighter that began life as a pure plane killer was now a long-range bomber, a rocket ship, and an ace maker, all in one airframe. Every month of the war, the men found new things the bent wingbird could do, and the plane kept saying yes to every one of them. The Navy had thrown it away for a landing, and now it was one of the most useful fighters flying anywhere in the whole world. Through all of it, the Corsair kept winning the one contest that mattered most, the fight of Corsair against enemy plane in the open sky. In battle after battle, the numbers told the very same story. Many enemy planes shot down for each single Corsair lost in air combat. The speed let the pilots choose their fights, the 6 guns ended those fights fast, and the thick armor carried the pilots back home alive. A Corsair could take hits that would tear a Zero to pieces, and it would still fly, still fight, and still land safely on its deck. Young men who once feared the Ensign Eliminator now trusted it with their lives on every long flight over the wide, empty Pacific water. The plane and the men had grown into each other over 3 hard years, and together they were emptying the enemy air force from the sky. When an enemy pilot heard that high whistle rising behind him, he knew what was coming, and most of them never got the chance to answer. When the war finally ended in the summer of 1945, the men sat down and added up all the fights, the kills, and the losses. In air combat, the Corsair had shot down about 2,140 enemy planes across the long years of the Pacific War. Against those kills, only about 189 Corsairs had been lost to enemy fighters in the air over that same span of time. Do the simple math and the number lands hard. More than 11 enemy planes destroyed for every single Corsair that fell in air combat. 11 to 1 from the plane the Navy had once thrown away as unfit to ever land on the deck of a carrier ship. The report that had called it unlandable was answered at last, not with words on paper, but with the wreckage of an entire enemy air force. The men who wrote that report had judged the plane in a hangar, but the enemy had judged it in the sky and named it death. Think back to that first carrier trial, to the high bounce, the blind nose, the sudden dropped wing, and the cruel little nickname. Every one of those problems had a fix, and every fix was small, plain, and cheap once the right person finally sat down to find it. A 6-inch strip of metal cured the roll, a raised seat cured the blindness, and a curving approach cured the fear of the deck. None of it was magic, and none of it changed the great engine or the 6 heavy guns that had always made the plane so strong. The Corsair was never a bad plane at all. It was only a misjudged one, rejected before anyone took the time to truly understand it. And once the men understood it, the same fighter they had thrown away became the most feared piston fighter in the whole ocean war. The lesson was written in the numbers, and it was written in blood, and it was written across the Pacific sky in smoke and fire. The story did not even end when the Second World War came to a close in that hot summer of 1945. The Corsair kept rolling off the factory lines, and it stayed in service far longer than almost any other fighter from that whole war. It had the longest production run of any American piston engine fighter, with more than 12,500 built before the lines finally shut down. The last one came off the line in 1953, more than 13 years after Boone Guyton first lifted the prototype off the runway. Other fighters from the war were scrapped and forgotten as the jets took over, but the Corsair kept flying and kept finding new work to do. When war came again in Korea, the Corsair went right back into the fight, flying from carriers and pounding targets on the frozen ground. The old bent-wing fighter proved once more that a plane built right in 1940 could still fight and win a full decade later. In Korea, the Corsair became the workhorse of the Marine and Navy pilots, flying low over the freezing hills to help the men on the ground. It carried bombs and rockets against the enemy, guarded the troops in the snow, and flew low through heavy fire coming up from the ground. When the Marines were cut off and surrounded near the Chosin Reservoir, the Corsairs flew over them again and again in the bitter cold. The pilots dove on the enemy troops closing in around the trapped men, dropping bombs and firing rockets to hold the ring of enemies back. "Keep them off us," a ground officer called on the radio, and the bent-wing fighters came screaming down through the icy sky to answer. The Corsairs helped the surrounded Marines fight their way out of the trap and down to the sea through miles of frozen mountain road. The old plane from the last war had become the shield over the heads of a new generation of Marines in a new and freezing war. In Korea, the Corsair even scored a kill that its own designers could never have dreamed of back in that quiet Connecticut drawing office. On the 10th of September 1952, a Corsair pilot named Jesse Falmer met a fast Russian-built jet fighter high over the water off Korea. The jet was the MiG-15, far faster than the old propeller plane, and by every rule of speed alone the fight should have been hopeless. But Falmer turned hard, waited for his one moment, and fired his cannons as the jet flashed across the front of his nose. His shells struck home, the jet came apart in the air, and the enemy pilot belayed out while the wreck fell toward the sea below. Minutes later, more jets swarmed Falmer and shot his own Corsair down, but he belayed out into the water and was quickly rescued alive. A propeller fighter from the last war had shot down a modern jet, and the Corsair had added one more impossible story to its long record. The Corsair also carried some of the bravest men of that war, including the first African-American pilot ever to fly for the United States Navy. His name was Jesse Brown, and he flew his Corsair low over the frozen hills near the Chasen Reservoir in the winter of 1950. Enemy fire hit his engine, and Brown brought the crippled fighter down hard onto a snow-covered mountainside far behind the enemy lines. The plane was smashed, and his leg was trapped in the wreck, and the deadly cold and the enemy were closing in from every side around him. Another pilot named Thomas Hudner landed his own good Corsair on purpose beside the wreck to try to pull his trapped friend free. Hudner clawed at the twisted metal with his bare hands in the snow, but he could not free Brown, and there was no time left. Brown died on that frozen mountain, but Hudner's courage in a Corsair earned him the Medal of Honor for what he had tried to do. That is the true measure of the plane the Navy first called unlandable, the men it carried and the great things it let them do. It let a mechanic's son named Walsh survive a fight against dozens of enemies and win the highest medal his country could ever give. It let a hard old pilot named Boyington Hunt over Rabaul until the whole nation knew the name of his Black Sheep Squadron. It let a fierce young flyer named Hansen down 25 planes in 17 days. And it let Kepford chase enemies down to the sea. It let one man try to save another on a frozen Korean mountain. And it let another shoot a modern jet clean out of the sky. Every one of those stories rode on the same bent wings that a report had once judged unfit to ever land on the fleet. The plane did not just win battles, it carried heroes. And it brought most of them home when a lesser plane would have failed. So the next time someone tells you that a tool is useless, remember the loud fighter with the strange bent wings and the long, proud nose. Remember that the Navy tested it, watched it bounce, and wrote it off completely before it had fired a single shot in real anger. Remember that the Marines took the cast-off, learned its ways, and turned it into the terror the enemy named Whistling Death over the islands. Remember the 6 inches of metal, the raised seat, and the curving approach. That fixed every single flaw the doubters had ever listed. And remember the final number, 11 enemy planes destroyed for every Corsair lost, written across the whole Pacific sky in fire and smoke. The Navy called the Corsair unlandable, and the Corsair answered by landing on their carriers and ending the war 11-1. The plane that could not land had the last word, and it spoke that word in a language the enemy understood far too late. Rex Beisel built the Corsair to be the fastest fighter alive, and it was. But that speed was never the real reason it became a legend. The legend came from the comeback, from the reject. That fought its way back onto the very decks that had once refused to take it. It came from the small fixes that beat the big problems, and from the pilots who trusted the plane when almost everyone else would not. It came from Guadalcanal and Rabaul, from Okinawa and Chasen, from every fight where the bent wings brought their men safely back home. A report is only a guess, and a guess can be wrong. No matter how many stamps and signatures it happens to carry with it. The Corsair was thrown away once, judged and dismissed, and it came all the way back to win, and that is why men still know its name. 11-1 was the final score, and the plane they threw away wrote it, one enemy at a time, until the long war was finally won.